Nearly everyone will be prescribed a medication at some point, whether it be an antibiotic for an infection or a treatment for a chronic condition. People depend on access to safe and high-quality medications. This is especially true for seniors. In 2021, a federal study found that 88.6% of older Americans surveyed reported having been prescribed at least one medication in the past 12 months. 91% of prescriptions filled are for generic drugs. The problem is, the United States relies disproportionately on foreign-made generic drugs from communist China and India. The U.S. currently depends on overseas manufacturers for about 75% of its essential drug supply. Communist China is not our friend. They are the world's largest producers of active pharmaceutical ingredients, and India relies on Communist China for approximately 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients they use. A study from Washington University in St. Louis found that 83% of the top 100 generic drugs consumed by U.S. citizens have no U.S.-based source of active ingredients. Not only is the U.S. over-dependent on foreign drugs, but these foreign drugs are often lower quality and more dangerous than drugs manufactured in the United States. Earlier this year, a study showed that serious adverse events like hospitalization and death were 54% more likely for foreign generic drugs compared to American-made drugs. Bad drug quality doesn't just mean that a drug is less effective, it can kill. In 2007-2008, the medication heparin had contaminated ingredients from Communist China, killing nearly 100 people. Deaths from unsafe medications like these contaminated heparin devastated families. Leroy Hubley lost his wife of 48 years, Bonnie, and his son, Randy, just weeks apart. Bonnie and Randy died due to contaminated heparin that they needed for their dialysis treatment they were undergoing due to a genetic kidney disease. People who relied on their medication and trusted that it was safe died. This was an absolute tragedy and must never happen again. But almost 20 years later, we are still seeing many of the same problems and quality issues that existed back then. There is still no routine testing done by the FDA and no incentive for quality. In 2023, contaminated eye drops from India killed 4 people and caused adverse events in at least 55 patients. Foreign drug manufacturing plants simply aren't subject to the same level of oversight as manufacturing plants here in the United States, and that doesn't make sense to any American. Inspections of the drug manufacturing facilities in the United States they're unannounced. In Communist China and India, many inspections are pre-announced up to weeks in advance, giving manufacturers time to present false conditions or conceal non-sterile and unsafe manufacturing practices. While many quality issues present an immediate threat to the lives of seniors and their loved ones, supply chain vulnerabilities presents an existential threat to the country. I know my remarks paint a very dark picture of the reality we face, but it gets much worse. Think about this. If Communist China or India want to shut down the supply of prescription drugs to the United States, they can do so at any moment. And currently, the United States does not have a backup plan. Let me say that again. If the Communist China or India decide to stop supplying the United States with prescription drugs, we will run out of prescription drugs very quickly, and people will die. Let that sink in. Millions of Americans will not have life-saving drugs available to them. Americans will get sick. Americans will die. We've seen China place export restrictions on rare earth elements over trade negotiations, and there's no reason they can't do that for drugs. Additionally, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw India block the export of critical ingredients. Many of the disruptions were prompted by supply chain disruptions from Communist China, the birthplace of the COVID-19 pandemic. We simply cannot rely on other countries, especially those who want to destroy us like Communist China, for something as vital as essential medicines. Yet, despite these dangers, we still depend almost entirely on Communist China and India for generic medications, and their grip on the market continues to grow. As of 2021, Communist China and India account for 85% of active drug master file submissions. 85%. Applications submitted to the FDA by companies that want to supply drug ingredients to another company. In 2000, that accounted for just 24%. The Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, the federal agency that oversees the Strategic National Stockpile, ensures the nation has medical countermeasures ready for public health emergency, lacks the data to understand the supply chain of the key starting materials or critical building blocks for pharmaceuticals. Communist China has a stranglehold on antibiotics, with 90% of global antibiotics being of Chinese origin. While Communist China and India have dominated the market, American manufacturing has just withered away. A 2024 report from the API Innovation Center stated that in the past decade, the number of facilities located in the U.S. that produce active pharmaceutical ingredients has decreased by 61%. In 2024, the U.S. manufactured 37% of its consumed pharmaceuticals. Just over 20 years ago, in 2002, that figure was 83%. Over 40% of generic drugs sold in the U.S. have just one FDA-approved manufacturer. I'm a business guy. You would never rely on one supplier. This means in the event of a shortage, the FDA must scramble to find an alternative. In 2023, the chemotherapy drug cisplatin went into shortage due to the FDA placing import restrictions on the manufacturer that account for 50% of the market. There was no FDA-approved alternative, which forced the FDA to turn a then unapproved Chinese drug company to fill in the gap. The supply chain is unacceptably vulnerable, and we can't just hope that shortages won't occur. If we can't solve this problem, our public health and national security are in grave danger and people will die. We will soon hold another hearing to discuss the solutions to these problems, but the American people deserve to know the dangers of bad quality medications and a vulnerable supply chain. Now let me turn it over to the ranking member, Jill Brand, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, for calling today's hearing. I really appreciate it. Thank you for our witnesses for being here today. Combating drug shortages and supporting high-quality generic drug production is one of the most important issues facing Congress today. In 2023, I heard from countless New York constituents who struggled with access to chemotherapy treatment due to shortages of essential generic cancer drugs, including cisplatin and carboplatin. I don't know if I said those right. When you are fighting a disease as devastating as cancer, the last thing you want to worry about is whether the life-saving drug that you need is available. Another issue that's extremely concerning is the quality of generic drugs, especially those that we import from overseas. I've heard time and time again that the difficulties the FDA foreign inspectors face when they are inspecting these foreign facilities. This can include basic logistical support or a third-party translator. When an inspector is abroad for months in a place where they may not speak the language, it can be very disheartening. Inspectors can also be put in a position where they must recommend the closure of a facility, but this can have a cascading effect of domestic generic shortages. The FDA needs adequate funding and support from Congress to ensure that they can not only conduct these inspections, but also enforce violations to protect the health and safety of the American public. We also need to work on solutions that promote transparency and quality benchmarks in the generic drug supply chain. The pharmaceutical supply chain can be very long and opaque, where several countries and companies are manufacturing various ingredients at various levels of quality. Purchasers need to be incentivized to purchase high-quality drugs that have proven reliability and a proven reliable supply chain. Hospital and practitioners are spending millions of dollars a year due to drug shortages. Ultimately, it's the health and safety of our patients and our constituents that are being put at risk. I'm looking forward to working on bipartisan solutions to promote safe and reliable supply chains for generic drugs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Experts who are here to talk about why dangerous, low-quality drugs have been allowed to enter the U.S. market and just how reliant we are on foreign countries for the medications we need. First, I'd like to recognize Peter Baker. Mr. Baker is a former FDA inspector who spent time in both India and Communist China. As an inspector, he witnessed firsthand the unsafe manufacturing conditions and tactics used by manufacturers to deceive and even obstruct the FDA from conducting proper investigations of manufacturing facilities. Mr. Baker, thank you for being here today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to thank you for this bipartisan focus on enhancing the security of our generic pharmaceutical supply chain. When a patient, especially those most vulnerable, such as the young and old, fill a prescription, which has a 91% chance of being generic here in the US, there can be no doubt about the safety and efficacy of the medicine or if the generic will perform as well as the brand name. There are too many uncontrollable variables to allow this one to play any role. The FDA has a long history of protecting and promoting public health and performs extremely challenging work around the world on a daily basis to achieve that goal through site inspections, often in remote corners of the world that do not have internationally recognized regulatory bodies, which I will refer to as unregulated markets. FDA investigators often have to deal with demanding travel conditions and can fall ill due to other unsafe conditions, such as drinking untreated water, a contaminated meal, communicable and non-communicable diseases, or fall prey to other risks often present in still developing nations. The majority of our overseas pharmaceutical inspections are pre-announced, often up to 2 months in advance of our arrival. In my experience, upon arrival for the inspection, a strong smell of paint is in the air, fresh paint. The landscaping is immaculate. All garbage cans are empty. Potential problematic operations are all shut down. Some employees are sent home, and critical operations are choreographed as if performing on a stage. Those of us who performed foreign inspections refer to this as the dog and pony show, which is frustrating because this is serious business. How do I know this to be true? Having spent 7 years in 3 different FDA foreign offices starting in 2012, based out of our embassies strategically located around the world, we were tasked with developing inspection techniques capable of identifying if products exported to the US from unregulated markets were really meeting our standards, because things seemed too good to be true. No rejected batches, no issues at all. Really. We knew the quality of products being manufactured in Ohio, but really had no idea what was happening outside of our borders, especially in unregulated markets. We spent countless hours reviewing computer records, dug through piles of garbage, and showed up at times unannounced, booking our travel through Expedia versus the embassy travel portal to alleviate any concerns. Someone would tip off the sites to our plans. What we found was terrifying. This testimony only addresses the tip of a massive iceberg. Fake laboratories pumping out hundreds of results a day that certified products as 100% pure, when in fact the product was never tested. For those products that did get tested, any failing result was simply ignored and replaced by a fabricated passing value. We identified filthy registered shadow facilities that would funnel their drugs through modern and clean registered sites, which we refer to as the show facility. We found fabricated manufacturing and quality records, painting a picture of a site in total compliance, when in fact substandard or fake medicines were being shipped to the US by the tens of thousands a day. Following these experiences, I have no doubt that adverse events, including death, happen on a daily basis here in the US as a result of substandard generic products from unregulated markets. The true culprit of these preventable adverse reactions lies in shortcuts and fraud. Shocking inspection reports continue to roll in on a monthly basis. The bad players list is no secret, and they continue to avoid any significant consequences. Meanwhile, those most vulnerable in our society taking these drugs have no idea of the games being played, and certainly no idea that the game, as designed today, can never be won. Personally, if I had a choice, I would never consume a drug product produced in an unregulated market, and any experienced FDA investigator will give you the same answer. When my 91-year-old grandma was alive, we would go pharmacy hopping around our rural Oregon hometown in the hopes of finding a batch that was made by a reliable producer. Sometimes we succeeded and sometimes not. I remember one time having to settle for a product manufactured by Ranbaxy, who had just settled with the DOJ for $500 million for faking countless data points used to demonstrate their products were safe. I tried to stay positive because causing her panic wasn't going to help, but inside I felt sick and I was not the one receiving cancer treatment. I urge this committee to consider these 4 points. 1, harsher penalties for companies who engage in illegal practices via the existing authority within FDA and DOJ. 2, changes to labeling so that patients can see where their medications were made and put pressure on supply chain decision makers to prevent them from taking a pill made from an unregulated market. 3, independent third-party testing of every batch of every product arriving from an unregulated market. The European Union already does this, and it's a proven model. 4, resources to support the Foreign Pharmaceutical Inspection Program. The FDA has made great progress to increase the number of unannounced inspections they are conducting, but they need additional resources to be directed to expand the number and quality of unannounced inspections, as already outlined by Commissioner Macri's public statements. Thank you for your time and attention to this important matter. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Ball from Indiana University, where his teaching and research focus on operations, supply chains, and regulatory compliance in the drug industry. Dr. Ball has been at the forefront of generic drug quality research, analyzing the intersection of global manufacturing, FDA oversight, and patient safety. His work provides critical insights into how supply chain vulnerabilities translate into risk for American consumers. In a study published this past February, he and his colleagues found that generic drugs manufactured in India have higher rates of adverse events compared to those made here in the United States. This research highlights in measurable terms what other witnesses have seen firsthand. Weaknesses in oversight of foreign manufacturing can directly affect the safety and quality of medicines reaching American patients. Dr. Ball, thank you for being here. I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and members of the committee for the invitation to speak with you. As Chairman Scott mentioned, I'm an operations management professor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. For the last 15 years, I've researched causes of product quality problems in FDA-regulated industries. Prior to that, I spent a decade as a medical device manufacturing manager. Most recently, my research has examined generic drug quality and FDA policy. These topics are the focus of my detailed submitted written testimony, which I will briefly overview now. In my view, the root cause of the generic drug quality problem is the original design of the generic drug marketplace. While the Hatch-Waxman Act lowered healthcare costs via affordable generic drugs, it relies on an unrealistic assumption. That is, if an original drug is safe and of high quality, then its generic counterparts will be as well, requiring little quality verification and no transparency. Why is this unrealistic? The answer lies in operations research regarding cost and quality, as well as sources of defects. First, quality is not free. Higher quality products normally require higher production costs. Further, quality defects originate from two primary sources: design and manufacturing. While the design of a generic drug must be equivalent to that of the original, two equivalently designed drugs can be made in vastly different ways. One can use well-trained employees, sophisticated equipment, and mature suppliers that make premium raw materials. Another can be made using poorly trained employees, cheap equipment, and corner-cutting suppliers. In a market where quality is assumed to be high, while it's unverified and opaque, the rational economic choice is to focus solely on cost. This will nearly guarantee poorly manufactured drugs. This assertion, however, has remained predominantly theoretical because identifying where a drug is made, which allows one to study plant, firm, or country-level factors that may influence drug quality, is quite onerous. As mentioned, a team of colleagues and I have recently published a study referenced in my submitted testimony that begins to address this gap. We exactly matched generic drugs made in the U.S. against equivalently designed generic drugs made in India. We find that generic drugs made in India, particularly older ones, that have lower profit margins with greater incentives to cut costs, have significantly more serious adverse events than equivalent generics made in the U.S. Two working papers that our team has under review, also referenced in my testimony, provide two policy changes that may help mitigate this problem. Transparency is first and foremost. In an experimental study with thousands of subjects, we find that consumers and pharmacists are unconvinced by FDA messaging that generic drug quality is to be trusted regardless of where it's made. We see a strong preference for US and Canada-made drugs over China and India-made ones when we only reveal manufacturing location. However, when location and quality are both made transparent, quality tempers these location effects. High-quality China or India-made drugs are preferred over lower but moderate quality US or Canada-made drugs. When comparing equally high-quality drugs, however, subjects continue to prefer US and Canada over China and India. Drug quality and location transparency can enable market forces to reward firms for high quality, regardless of where they are made, while simultaneously incentivizing high-quality onshoring and nearshoring of generic manufacturing. Second to this is aligning FDA's inspection strategy across the globe. As has already been mentioned, the FDA inspects China and India plants after giving weeks or months of advance notice versus conducting them unannounced in the U.S. In another working paper that we have under review, we've examined newly available data from an FDA unannounced inspection pilot conducted in India. We conclude that pre-announcing inspections hinders the FDA's ability to assess the true state of quality at foreign manufacturing plants. We show that such inspection obscurity aggravates the cost-only focus, harming generic drug quality. I advocate for drug quality and location transparency, as well as global FDA inspection parity. Our research indicates these two changes should help to meaningfully improve generic drug quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ball. Now I'd like to introduce Brandon Daniels. Mr. Daniels is the Chief Executive Officer of Exiger, a global leader in supply chain risk management, transparency, and compliance. With decades of experience in regulatory compliance and technology, Mr. Daniels has led efforts to help governments and private industry strengthen the security and integrity of critical supply chains, including those in pharmaceuticals, defense, and healthcare. At Exiger, he has overseen the development of innovative tools that identify vulnerabilities, improve visibility, and help ensure that products and medicines reaching American consumers are safe, reliable, and free from hidden risk. Mr. Daniels, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. For 20 years, I have worked with pharmaceutical and medical device companies, supporting them through some of the most significant crisis management and litigation matters affecting their product development, research, and supply chains. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I served on the White House's Joint Acquisition Task Force, where I worked alongside federal partners to secure PPE, medical devices, and life-saving pharmaceuticals. That experience underscored for me the fragility of our pharmaceutical supply chains and the urgent need for reform. In my role at Exiger, I'm leading the development of artificial intelligence to map supply chains down to their raw material origins. This work reveals in precise detail the vulnerabilities hidden in our healthcare system. The scope of this problem is enormous. America's medicine cabinet is no longer made in America. Nearly 3/4 of the essential medicines used in the United States are sourced overseas. India now supplies about half of the generic drugs we consume, but 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that make those drugs possible come from China. In fiscal year 2024, Chinese firms supplied 77% of India's penicillin G and 94% of its 6-APA, which is the indispensable intermediate for penicillin-derived antibiotics. This concentration creates a dangerous single point of failure for drugs that every hospital, clinic, and pharmacy in this country depend on. That means a Medicaid prescription filled in Ohio or a Medicare prescription processed in Florida can often be traced back to a Chinese supplier. The choke points for our most basic medicines are controlled by Beijing. And we are not just dependent, we are actively financing that dependency. In 2024, Medicaid reimbursed more than $150 million to a single generic drug company that sourced ingredients from at least 6 Chinese firms tied to forced labor and national security concerns. Dual-eligible patients, who represent just about 14% of Medicaid enrollment but consume more than a third of its spending, are the most exposed to this fragile system. Every taxpayer dollar spent on these medicines strengthens the leverage Beijing has over our healthcare system. The consequences for seniors and all American citizens cannot be ignored. As Chairman Scott mentioned, contaminated eye drops from India have left American seniors permanently blind. Blood pressure and diabetes medications imported from Asia have been recalled after testing positive for carcinogenic impurities. These are not outliers. Over 30% of recent FDA import alerts involve Chinese producers, and another 16% involve Indian suppliers. These are the very countries we rely on most. Even more troubling, our data shows that forced labor is woven into these pharmaceutical supply chains. Chinese state-owned enterprises with documented links to Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang supply raw materials and active ingredients that ultimately find their way into drugs consumed by Americans. This creates both an economic competitiveness barrier through labor arbitrage and a quality hazard for U.S. pharmaceutical supply chains. The weakness in our medicine cabinet is also a weakness in our national security. More than 54% of the Department of War's pharmaceutical supply chain is classified as high or very high risk because of reliance on foreign suppliers. Chinese state media has openly suggested that drug exports could be withheld as a weapon in conflict. In that scenario, the most basic medicines in our hospitals, our pharmacies, our military stockpiles could become tools of coercion. No adversary needs to fire a shot if they can choke off our access to antibiotics or insulin. The path forward will not be simple, but it is clear. We must expand domestic production of critical medicines, particularly antibiotics and essential generics. We must diversify supply chains to trusted allies and ensure no federal program relies on a single country. We must enforce forced labor laws so that no American patient consumes medicine produced through coercion. And we must demand transparency at every level, using modern mapping and monitoring to stress test these supply chains before they fail. The stakes could not be higher. Every time a senior fills a prescription, every time a service member receives treatment, every time our children and grandchildren need to fight an ear infection, there is a real chance the supply chain leads back to a potentially compromised source. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Now we're going to hear from Ranking Member to introduce the next witness.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I want to move to introduce our next witness, Dr. Ronald Piervincenzi. As Chief Executive Officer of U.S. Pharmacopeia, Dr. Piervincenzi is responsible for providing strategic leadership to his global staff of over 1,300 employees. Dr. Piervincenzi has helped USP modernize and expand its operations, including in the areas of digital medicine, advanced biologics, quality manufacturing, consulting, and education. You may begin.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gillibrand and Chairman Scott, and members of the committee for the opportunity to provide the testimony here today about the United States medicine supply chain that our nation's seniors rely on. As CEO of the United States Pharmacopeia, I sometimes have to describe who we are. And USP is an independent scientific nonprofit organization founded on the 1st of January in 1820, when 11 physicians gathered together in the old Senate chamber, concerned about the safety and quality of imported medicines to the then new United States. On that day, they formed the world's first national pharmacopeia. Today, the 1,200 employees work with hundreds of scientific experts to set thousands of quality standards for medicines. USP also offers ingredient verification, product quality testing, and programs to advance the adoption of pharmaceutical advanced manufacturing technologies. USP works to strengthen medicine supply chains to ensure that patients, and especially older Americans managing the chronic conditions, can access the generic medicines they need when they need them, and very importantly, to trust in their consistent quality. Low-cost generic drugs, which account for over 90% of the U.S. medicine supply, have grown quantitatively and increasingly vulnerable to geopolitical tensions, natural disasters, pandemics, and importantly, market pressures. The globalization has expanded capacity and lowered costs, but it has also made the supply chains longer, more fragmented, and less transparent, jeopardizing both patient care and national security. Since launching the Medicine Supply Map in 2019 to gain insight into an opaque supply chain, USP now analyzes 94% of U.S. prescription drugs, providing unprecedented visibility into key public health and national security vulnerabilities. USP's work quantitatively points to 4 interconnected drivers of our vulnerability. The first is a continual downward pricing pressure on generic drugs that creates an unsustainable market for these essential medicines. The vulnerability number 2 is manufacturing complexity, which is limiting capacity and causing an even greater risk. Third vulnerability is geographic concentration, exposing supply to single points of failure wherever those might be. And finally, the fourth vulnerability are quality disruptions, which destabilize the supply. These four factors combine to create an environment that undervalues resilience, constrains abilities to build redundancy, and discourages reinvestment in quality systems. This leaves patients, especially vulnerable seniors, at risk of delayed access or reliant on less effective secondary treatments. It's simply unacceptable when we know practical solutions exist. No one stakeholder is to blame for the current state of our supply chain, but our hurdle is rather our willingness to take this first step together. A solution must uphold quality, incentivize greater stewardship of our supply chain, and preserve the savings that generic medicines have delivered to patients and seniors. I commend the chair and the ranking member for their holistic approach and respectfully urge the committee to consider the following solution in 3 parts. Part 1 is to improve the supply chain visibility, identifying key vulnerabilities, and updating this assessment continuously. Tools like the Medicine Supply Map provide the intelligence needed for proactive risk management. Understanding risk starts with increasing visibility into our current blind spots, such as the vulnerable essential medicines, widely used excipients, and single-source key starting materials. We recommend authorizing an annual assessment that provides insights into our most significant vulnerabilities and makes recommendations for mitigation. These insights could help guide commercial investment to shore up risky supply lines, certainly involve and inform policymaking, and direct agency attention and funding where it matters most. Part 2 of the solution is to create pathways for America to innovate and scale new methods for manufacturing essential medicines. Advanced manufacturing, alternative synthesis routes, and new biology-based methods are no longer theoretical. USP is partnering with ARPA-H today to explore wheat germ extract as a US-based method for producing a critical API, thymidine, an example of how the US government might leverage advanced manufacturing to reduce reliance on foreign sources for key ingredients. And part 3, establish a benchmark for a stronger, more resilient medicine supply. The most important factor underlying the fragility of the US medicine supply chain is the unsustainable US generics market. Pricing pressure on low-cost essential medicines drives generic drug purchases below sustainable production costs, discouraging investment in quality systems and pushing manufacturing offshore. Shifting the paradigm to reward a more resilient supply of medicines is central to promoting an environment that values reliability, reinvestment in quality systems, and a competitive domestic industrial base. Specifically, we propose a resiliency benchmark for manufacturers of important medicines, paired with incentives for purchasers to prioritize those who meet it, encouraging sustainable procurement and investment in quality systems, surge capacity, diversified supply, and greater domestic production. To help ensure that America's seniors have consistent access to quality, the government should leverage Medicare's significant purchasing power, along with the DoD and VA, to incentivize the resilience. Strengthening the supply is a national security imperative and critical to millions of seniors. Together, we can and must forge a more secure future for America's medicine supply. The well-being of millions depends on it, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Piervincenzi. Now we'll go to questions. I'll turn it over to Senator Ron Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. This may be the most important hearing of this Congress, maybe many Congresses. Now, it's not getting much attention, but it needs to. I first became aware of our vulnerability in February of 2020, my first hearing as Chairman of Homeland Security about the pandemic, and I had Scott Gottlieb, Judy Gerberding there. I had no idea that we were so dependent on advanced API and the precursor chemicals on China and India. Have we done anything about it? No. We passed a $1.25 trillion infrastructure bill, didn't even address it. So I think the issue is how do you bring the manufacturing back to the U.S. where it can be inspected properly, right? It's not an easy task, but part of the problem is the precursor chemicals, that's refining. And that needs permitting. And that's expensive to do in America, which is why we've offshored it to China. So, how do we do it? I mean, what I like, and this was Mr. Ball's suggestion here, and I'd love to co-sponsor this bill with you, just simply requiring labeling in terms of where the drug comes from. That'll put a tremendous pressure on the companies to reshore these things. Not going to happen overnight, but, government edicts, spending money to bring, what you could do potentially is just not tax somebody who brings a refinery over here, but you got to be able to permit it. So, there's so many impediments to this. This is a very complex issue, but we've got to start doing the basics first. But the first one is, again, understanding the problem, acknowledging we have it, understanding how vulnerable we truly are. Things like heparin. We've known about this for years, and we've literally done nothing about it. So again, I'm looking for really the most practical first steps we can take. We can talk about all kinds of complex solutions, but would you agree that just the labeling itself, that'd be pretty easy to be able to pass? Be interesting to see if we could. Anybody? I guess I want from all four of you, what is your number one single first step that we could take here to address this? And by the way, first it starts with information. And we need a lot more information. Again, there's all this, you've all mentioned the pricing pressure, right? We're all beating up on drug companies overpricing. Well, the fact is, on generics, it's probably underpriced is what you're telling us. But let's just go down the list and just give me kind of the one thing that the first step we ought to take.
From my perspective, I think enforcing the existing laws as they are already written through the authority of the FDA and DOJ would let the good players know that it's going to be a level playing field for them. And so
we have laws that are not being enforced. Why? How would you enforce them?
it's difficult to enforce them at the moment because of the issue of drug shortages. So when issues are uncovered at some of these factories, they're allowed to, they're carved out the ability to keep supplying these drugs, because if they were prevented from entering the U.S., then we'd have a supply chain issue, right, a shortage issue. So it's going to have to be weaning off of that situation, but it's going to have to start with letting everybody know that the laws are going to be enforced, and it's going to.
So
yeah.
One thing Congress relies on is whistleblowers. Again, I've been trying to pull information out of government agencies for many years now. Okay, they don't give up their secrets very well. Will there be whistleblowers that will tell us of those instances where there's a quality problem here and FDA just looked the other way? I mean, we're going to need examples of that.
Absolutely. FDA works with whistleblowers all over the world, pretty much on a daily or weekly basis.
So I guess I would encourage whistleblowers to come forward to this committee or permanent subcommittee investigation. Tell us your story so we can highlight that, so we can expose it, so we actually start enforcing our laws. Mr. Ball, I already used yours, but if you got a better one.
Well, I agree with you, obviously, because it was something I talked about, but it's the only marketplace where firms do not reveal their quality and consumers that purchase a product cannot assess it. And so the marketplace is not allowed to work properly for the generic drugs. If quality and location are transparent, the market would fix, in my view, and from the research we've done, quite a bit of the problem. Because market forces would then start to reward high-quality manufacturers and punish low-quality ones. It's a relatively inexpensive solution because it's somewhat the invisible hand of the market would fix this issue if the market was no longer opaque. But when it's opaque, the market is broken. And we've thought long and hard about other comparable markets like this, and there are very few.
Right.
So I think transparency of both quality and location is the answer.
I use that when I said it's about information. The consumers need information, which we don't have right now. Mr. Daniels.
So I think the biggest thing from my perspective is right now we have economic coercion on the other side that's keeping these key starting materials in particular at artificially low prices. That's not actually how much they cost to manufacture. They're significantly subsidized. They're in free economic zones. In many cases, they're using labor that is insufficient in order to conduct these operations. And so there's got to be an economic disincentive, some sort of AD/CVD against the KSMs that China's dumping into the market in order to create a U.S. domestic market that's available and viable. And there are today whether it's in fermentation for critical key starting materials for antibiotics, or it's for drugs like heparin. There are continuous flow manufacturing capabilities that we could bring to the United States. And everyone thinks it's going to take some huge delta between the current price and the future price to bring investment into a market. It's not. I mean, you remember in 2008, we had gas prices spike. IKEA brought Swedwood, their furniture manufacturing, back to Danville, North Carolina, because of the small additional cost that sat on the top of every piece of furniture. They brought their entire manufacturing capability
As long as we can
back.
permit it. So I'd
Yeah, the
suggest,
permitting is a big piece.
all of you help us identify those drugs or drug that we need to start with.
Yeah.
You start with one, succeed in that, and then move forward. Mr. Piervincenzi, I think I got that right.
Thank you,
Close.
Senator Johnson. Perfectly. Thank you. Appreciate that. I would suggest a market-based resiliency benchmark, which is a positive incentive. It would need to be market-based. It would absolutely require the government to kickstart it. And this would reward the resiliency of having a secure facility has past inspections on a consistent basis, all the things we know. And in fact, we created a draft of these type of benchmarks that incorporate just about every factor that was shared, very much including location of production, your own supply chain. And from that, even if we were to start, let's say, in hospital systems for hospital-used drugs as a starting point, although I'm not saying it's the whole solution, and then put a hook on that where hospitals have to reward this through a better contract, a slightly better price. And these are the cheapest medicines, which means a better price is still not going to break the bank.
I think hospitals are still going to be opaque. I think it's got to be consumers. And if you have too many elements in that benchmark, again, it's going to be difficult to pass. So that's why I'm kind of looking, how about just country of origin as a starting point? But anyway, Mr. Chairman, honestly, this is an incredibly important hearing. I want to work very closely with you and your witnesses and other experts on this, and we need whistleblowers. The only way this gets passed in Congress is that the American public has to understand how vulnerable we are and what risk they're at, okay? But thank you for this hearing.
Thank you. Ranking Member Gillibrand.
I'd like to turn it over to Senator Kim.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. I agree. This is an incredibly important issue, and I hope that this is something that can spur us to work in a bipartisan way. And certainly from my state of New Jersey, a lot of what we need to be thinking about in terms of what comes next when it comes to medicine, pharmaceutics, but recognizing that we need to do a lot more when it comes to the manufacturing and the supply chain side and make us more resilient. I think resilient is the right word. Because we see not just with the national security side, but a lot when it comes to just the economic competitiveness of the United States and understanding where we need to be going to on a number of different fronts. I'd like to just pick up where my colleague left off. Dr. Piervincenzi, I just wanted to get a little bit more of a sense. This market-based resilience benchmark, I think you framed. Is there a comparable example, or is there something that is being used in other industries or sectors that can help us kind of understand how this might come about and how it might be structured?
Thank you for that question. And yes, in fact, you don't have to leave the pharmaceutical industry. Let's take a sophisticated multinational company, generic or innovator. They do this themselves on the goods they purchase. And so let's say you're in a large innovator pharma company and you're looking to ensure that your multi-billion-dollar product is never short, because you have a huge economic incentive to do so. What you do in your own supply chain is you would never buy all your key ingredients from one place. You'll have 2 sources for every ingredient. In addition, you'll send your team to inspect their facilities and make sure they meet your own quality standards. You create a contract which is a long enough term that the supplier is committed to you just as you're committed to them. This is normal. Everybody does this. This is nothing innovative. That process I just described, it works. It's why innovator drugs are not on the shortage list, except for unusual demand spikes, which we know are something entirely different.
And how do we then take that type of model, though, at a societal level? We're not talking about just a company looking out for its own bottom line. And in particular, what is the role of government? What can government do that others can't do so that we can understand how to fit this all together?
And the key here is that the buyer in the case I just described, is one single company with a rational reason to create a resilient supply. And the challenge we have in the U.S. is there are thousands and thousands of buyers who all wish this to be true, don't feel empowered to do so, and actually don't have the mechanism to even pay more money because they don't know what they're paying for. So then the answer would have to be both the creation of the benchmark, so they no longer have the excuse that they don't know how to pay for quality. And once you have that, then you have to create an incentive, or perhaps force, there to be contracts that reward people for scoring high on those benchmarks. There are different parts of our drug supply, which will be harder in some than others, but we believe that where you see the most drug shortages today, which are in hospital-administered drugs, is actually probably one of the easier places for leverage, especially because the federal government has its own leverage for how it purchases medicines, and you see this in quality of care, the tools that can be used. So I'm not saying it's extremely easy, but it's not unprecedented even in healthcare.
No, thank you for that. Dr. Ball, I wanted to just pick up on something you said, which is about that quality assessment and being able to have that alongside the geographic. Can you give me a better sense of how that quality assessment could be done at the scale of what we're talking about here?
Absolutely. So the paper I referred to assumes that the FDA's site selection model scores, which are risk-adjusted scores that the FDA uses both at the drug and plant level to determine when to inspect a plant, that some form of those would be amalgamated into a 5-star rating on a drug, and that a 5-star would be the lowest risk facility, 3-star would be moderate risk, and that's what we used in this study. The FDA has this data. They would be very resistant, I believe, from my experience in discussing this with them, to give it out and use it, but it's at least a starting point. And it's a combination of adverse events, recalls, inspection scores, anything that's happened at the plant or the drug that is a negative experience creates a higher risk drug, and that would be used to put a score on the label.
I see. Mr. Baker, I just want to end with you here. You know, in your testimony, you highlighted how FDA investigators often have to deal with demanding travel schedules and conditions, can fall ill, how, in many parts, in many of these inspections are taking place in locations where English may not be a primary language spoken, yet there is no requirement for independent translators. I wanted to just get a little bit more of a sense for you. What steps do you think Congress should prioritize to ensure that we're giving our FDA workforce the support that they need, and also just thinking through, are there other steps like better strengthening our collaboration with foreign regulators and other steps that we can do to try to address these needs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think one of the things that can be done is to increase the level of investment in the FDA investigators. A lot of disruption happened in the FDA during the COVID times, where a lot of, for example, on-site training and hands-on training was sort of moved to remote, and that isn't as effective. Prior to that, it would take 2 or 3 years to get qualified, so to speak, to do a foreign inspection, whereas now, due to resource constraints, you may be tasked with doing those inspections, those challenging inspections that you just mentioned, in like 2 months after getting hiring. May not have the skills and the training necessary to do those effectively. It's very challenging. You'll fly into an airport and then you get in it, especially if you're trying to do it unannounced. You're going to get in a taxi, someone you don't know, and drive 4 to 6 hours to get to your hotel that may or may not have air conditioning.
Yeah.
It's very difficult and challenging. They need additional support to really enhance this existing program that they know works. Those unannounced inspections have about a 4-time greater chance of identifying a problem that's going to cause harm to a human versus unannounced. That's what the data shows. Great. They're very effective. So investment in that area is worth the effort.
Thank you.
Yeah.
With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Senator Kim. Mr. Baker, as a former FDA inspector, are you confident in the quality and safety of generic drugs coming from foreign countries like China and India?
Thanks for that question. The answer is going to be no. I'm not confident about the quality. I am confident in the sites that I've been to, and I've seen world-class sites everywhere in the world manufacturing drugs, and I am confident in taking those products. But for the majority, I would say no.
Dr. Ball, what types of adverse events, deaths did you find foreign medications caused in your research?
So we found examples of cardiac arrest, gastrointestinal hemorrhage, delirium, cellulitis, acidosis. Those were just a random sample I took this morning of the adverse events in our study. There's millions of adverse events that get reported to the FDA's adverse event reporting system. These are just a few. So if they're serious, and in this paper, we only counted those adverse events that were caused by the drug, reported by the manufacturer, mandatory to report, and caused serious health outcomes. And there's still millions of those.
Do you think they might be underreported?
So I think underreporting is a problem for recalls and adverse events, and it leverages a lot with what Peter mentioned. The more FDA is present in a facility in an unannounced manner, the less likely an unreporting will go, because you can discover unreported events in these inspections, but not if they're announced weeks or months in advance. Those are exactly the type of things that a firm is likely to hide if they have advance notice. If they don't, it's very hard to hide those things. So the FDA inspection strategy goes hand in hand with reducing these adverse events.
Mr. Daniels, how much supply of drugs do we have if Communist China shuts supply off to the United States?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. The supply chains are interwoven, and I think that's the biggest issue, because you will have specialty pharmaceuticals that are untouched for 6-9 months. But then when you start to get to the end of that supply chain and that manufacturing process, you might have severe runs on the key starting materials or the precursors that are necessary to support that drug manufacturing. In the context of generics, and specifically critical generics like antibiotics, heart medications, insulin, you could see all supply outside of what is used in emergency rooms shut down within months if China decided to stop supply to the United States, especially if they decided to stop supply chains on a supply chain-like sanction, like we've done on forced labor prevention in China. If they stopped the sort of intermediaries from selling to us the goods that are manufactured utilizing their materials, it could be a severe constraint that would look cataclysmic.
Dr. Piervincenzi, USP is a global organization with labs and operations abroad. From your perspective, are foreign-made drugs consistently meeting USP standards, or do you see widespread quality failures?
Thank you, Senator. And may I also just maybe build a bit on Mr. Daniels' comment. The quantifying if the China were to cut off supply, what would the impact be, is challenging. But in the next about 2 months or so, USP will issue a report that covers about 90% of our generic supply. So not all of it, but a vast majority, that will map down to the key starting material and location of origin. And so we'll actually be the first time ever be able to answer it. A rough number, though, just because we have to start with something, half our medicines come from India, 70-80% of their starting materials come from China. You start to do the math, it's not going to be a majority, but it's going to be a very large percentage of U.S. medicines that would become highly vulnerable. Some completely, but many highly, highly disrupted and short.
And do you have any feel for how much is in the supply chain that's already in the United States? But I mean, I can't imagine that I used to run a hospital company. I don't think we sat there and said, let's have 1 year supply of drugs just in case something happens. So do you have any feel for what a typical doctor's office, a group purchasing organization or hospital would have in inventory?
So at the very end of the supply chain is extremely little. But if you were to say what's onshore in the United States at a distributor and such, of course it varies, but it's months, not years and not weeks. It's months. If you continue down to your starting materials and your API, it gets a little longer. And that matters because it makes it hard for us to get signals. Something might happen, the manufacturer stops producing, and everything seems fine for a while. 9 months goes by, and suddenly we have a shortage. It's not really sudden, but it appears sudden at the end because it takes a while for the chain. And since we don't have good transparency, we're not watching this happen as it comes along. So months is the answer.
Okay.
However, as soon as somebody knows it's been cut off, hoarding behavior begins, and the shortage would take a matter of days in real life. In real life, you would know if a hurricane hits a plant and everyone knows there's a problem, everything will be bought up within
Stores
hours.
are empty in hours, actually.
Yeah, so if nobody knows it happened, of course, then would it be months, but odds are it's going to leak, right?
Okay. All right, let me turn it over to Ranking Member Gillibrand.
Thank you. For Mr. Piervincenzi, what are the risks of relying solely on the United States for production of drugs, and what precautions can we take against such risks?
Thank you, Senator. One of the 4 drivers of resilience was the geographic concentration. That's agnostic to location. There are different issues about quality that we're also talking about. Some of the most acute drug shortages the U.S. has had in the last few years have been actually on U.S. shores. We've had an unfortunate hurricane and other things. So natural disasters, just things can happen, and they do. It's possible to create diversification even within the United States as long as you don't have all your plants in one place. And so there's a nuance to this, what geographic diversity looks like. If you have 2 plants in North Carolina across the street from each other, I'd argue that's not very resilient. But if one was on the West Coast and one on the East Coast, you might be in pretty good shape.
In your testimony, you indicate the importance of aligning supply and demand forces so that American patients have more predictable, sustainable, and quality supply chain. How can the federal government promote a coordinated effort amongst different stakeholders to move towards a resilient supply chain?
So the simple answer is somebody has to pay for it. And I think you've heard 4 different versions of that same thing here, is that somebody has to be not just willing to, but able to. So a willingness says, I'm willing to pay 13 cents rather than 10 cents for a pill. Just about everyone's willing to do that. The problem today is no one has any evidence of how do I do that. I can pay 13 cents for the same pill. Doesn't buy me more resilience. So this is where a large organization, very much including the U.S. government, has that power. And to say, for now on, especially for a certain set of drugs that we know are vulnerable, we will only pay with resilience, meaning this is what we expect, and you will get this price. The market solution like that means if somebody doesn't meet those benchmarks, they will be less preferred. So the market can fill in. It won't force it. It's not a binary decision. But because margins are so small, just having small, tiny bit, paying just a bit more or having a slightly longer contract could make an enormous difference. And I think that's the benefit of this problem, is that it can be solved with much less money than if these were expensive medicines.
Mr. Daniels, in your written testimony, you recommend the federal government conduct regular stress tests of the pharmaceutical supply chain to stimulate worst-case scenarios and identify weak points before failure. Can you speak a bit more about how the federal government could address identified weak points from these stress tests?
Absolutely, and thank you, Ranking Member Gillibrand. So 2 things. One, just to speak about what Dr. Piervincenzi just mentioned, there are multiple ways to reduce the cost of these drugs as we reshore them. One of them is also relying on the innovation of our allies, right? I mean, there is a global market for pharmaceuticals, and as we start to look at that market, we do need to diversify both location, but also we need to diversify in platforms. And so if in many cases, there are multiple areas of the supply chain where we are advising our customers, which are the Fortune 500, we're advising our customers to find 2 or 3 suppliers downstream to purchase metals, to purchase chemicals, to purchase goods from. They can do 2 things at that point. They can, 1, utilize their purchasing power to actually reduce the cost of the underlying chemicals, precursors, whatever it might be, key starting materials. 2, they can give back some of that. Our customers, when they do what's called a directed or embedded spend program, they typically save between 7 to 22% on landed cost on the end good. they can actually share back some of that to get to a resilient supply chain and to get to a supplier that's willing to agree to ethical quality standards. So these programs exist today. They exist in other industries. They're not as common in pharmaceutical supply chains, but there are pharma companies in Europe that we're working with today that are engaged in these activities, and they're doing it specifically to address CSDDD. To get to your second question, which is on these stress tests, we've been working across a number of different federal agencies, DLA, FDA, to map the 227 critical medicines within our supply chains, and to understand what are the consequences of whether it's disruption, like the hurricane, which knocked out our IV fluids capacity in the United States, or it's major shortages and wargaming due to conflicts with near-peer adversaries, or if it's due to significant changes in availability of underlying materials. When we're doing this analysis, it's simple supply chain planning. Companies do this all the time. Now, what we have to do is we have to work probably across a consortium with companies like Exiger and Pharmacopeia to create a complete view of the supply chain. And that complete view of the supply chain doesn't stop at sort of the specialty pharma or the innovative pharma company or the generic pharma company and their suppliers. It has to go all the way down. And what we have to see is that reverberating impact. Because Dr. Piervincenzi said it is true that many companies have 15 suppliers of the same product at that next tier. And then they have 4 suppliers at the next tier. And then it goes back to 1. And just no one knows it. That's what happened with ventilators during the COVID-19 pandemic. All of our solenoid valves went back to one company in Italy. And so even though Ford and GM and everybody stood up to make more ventilators, we couldn't truly make more because there was only one company that had that solenoid valve for the commodity ventilators. So we actually have to make sure that mapping is complete, and then we have to make sure that we're assessing all of the risks that can actually impact that environment, whether it's geopolitical, it's natural disasters, or it's material shortages.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McCormick.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Baker, can you describe what level of transparency already exists for American healthcare consumers with regard to what country a medicine or its APIs are from, and what improvements could be made to ensure Americans have better insight and understanding on the origins of their medicines?
Yeah, at the moment, that the transparency in the supply chain as far as what patients know about where their medications are made is virtually non-existent. There could be some improvements in the labeling. It's a complicated issue because there's many players in the supply chain, as outlined already, from the key starting materials all the way to the finished drug. So we would have to take a risk-based approach where the most critical step, like for example, if it's an aseptically filled product that's intended for injection, the step in a supply chain at which that product was aseptically filled in a sterile environment would be on the label. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best we can do to help increase transparency and let the market fix the issues as already outlined by my colleagues.
Thank you. And Mr. Daniels, how can technology and AI be deployed for hospitals and others to map their supply chains? I know you touched on this at some level. And what can be done to advance any reshoring or nearshoring of drugs and APIs?
Thank you, Senator McCormick, for the question. So first, hospitals are mapping their supply chains. We work with multiple hospitals across the United States to map their supply chains. They also, in large part, go back to large distributors, right, that are intermediaries between those hospitals and the actual drug manufacturers or medical device manufacturers or PPE manufacturers. But the key first step is to use artificial intelligence to actually break down that bill of material of each of those pharmaceuticals and then tie those back to the literal suppliers that those pharmaceuticals are coming from. But the thing is, you can't just map the products you're buying. you should be mapping the products you're not buying. And what I mean by that is you should understand the spectrum or the panoply of alternative suppliers that you have available to you prior to a major disaster. The customers of ours, we're endorsed by the American Hospital Association as the risk management technology company for all U.S. hospitals. And the customers of ours that had our software deployed knew almost a month in advance that IV fluids would be subject to disruption due to Hurricane Helene. And so that kind of visibility, of course, it can lead to the stockpiling point that we just made, but it also can save American lives, especially in operating rooms. The second question you had was on the reshoring. I mean, first, Senator Johnson brought up this point. One of the biggest issues we have is permitting. We have a huge backlog and delays in permitting of new facilities and capabilities. The other thing is a lot of this stuff is pretty dirty to make. So acetaminophen, just taking as an example, creates a waste broth that the EPA would not allow us to dispose of in the way that India or China does today. And so one of the things that we have to look at is that there are novel ways to actually manufacture these. And these aren't novel ways that are not taken to scale yet through BARDA and multiple other programs that are looking for advanced research and development capabilities in emerging biotechnology. In BARDA, we've actually taken some of the continuous flow manufacturing capabilities to scale. So first, if we can permit, we can actually make it cost effective. And then the second thing is, with AI and automation in the actual manufacturing line, we take away the single and only differentiation between us and emerging markets in manufacturing pharmaceuticals at scale, which is labor arbitrage. Yeah. And so implementing AI and automation inside of the pharmaceutical manufacturing process, I mean, there are places in North Texas that are cheaper than places in Shenzhen, right? We can start building these factories and actually start competing on a global basis.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for having this hearing. Great topic. Thank you.
Senator Austin Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair Scott. Thank you so much, Ranking Member Gillibrand, for hosting today's hearing. And thank you so much as well to our witnesses for being here. What we know is far too many seniors still face the cruel reality of needing medication that they can't reliably access or afford. High drug prices, unexpected shortages, and now Secretary Kennedy's policies are preventing Americans from accessing the medicine and vaccines that will keep them safe and healthy. This couldn't be a more relevant topic. In the past few weeks, I've heard from my constituents, so many seniors across our state who are eligible for the latest COVID vaccine, and they are now being turned away because of the confusion caused by Secretary Kennedy's new guidelines, and others are being told that their local pharmacy is struggling to stock the vaccine because of the lag between FDA approval and the forthcoming recommendations from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. So when it comes to vaccines, we know that that so much doubt is being cast on life-saving vaccines as well as dismantling our public health infrastructure. And that's why this conversation is so critical. Seniors deserve not just reliable medications, but a health system that they can trust to put science and safety above politics. My first question is for Dr. Piervincenzi, and I'd like to ask you, when we see how fragile our drug supply chains can be when it comes to medicines that seniors rely on, and vaccines, we know, are no different. This is a time, as I've mentioned, when Secretary Kennedy, I believe, is really destabilizing public trust in vaccines, and older Americans can't afford disruptions to flu, RSV, or COVID. So I would like to know, how has the confusion regarding vaccine approvals and recommendations this year made seniors across the country less safe?
Thank you, Senator. An interesting fact on the vaccines is, compared to many of the low-cost generics, there are quite a few manufactured in the United States. And if you consider United States, Europe, Canada, there's a disproportionately high quantity. So there is the ability for FDA to do more robust inspections, including surprise, for majority of vaccine sites. And so the public should have more confidence, if anything, that they're able to rely on the quality of the vaccines. As a complex biologic, there are linkages to the complex generics that are the ones showing up on the shortage lists the most. And because they're the kind of medicines used in hospital, just for that reason alone, they are impacting two groups the most. The most senior, especially in oncology, and the youngest, the pediatric population, also tending to be oncology, but not only. And these two populations have been most affected. There's an extra layer to this problem, is that these are the medicines that are least substitutable. It is an art form to try to treat these cancers. We haven't cured cancer, so the best we can do is slow it down in many cases. But a small change from one chemotherapy to another, and the progression advances, it's the person's life is at stake. So the vulnerability isn't just about the medicine, but about the patient and essentially what the next best alternative is. So from a quality standpoint, items like vaccines are very different because they're given, of course, to a healthy patient. So you're measuring it in two very different ways. However, a poor quality vaccine, you're only going to test that perhaps 30 or 40 years later when you're exposed to a disease. So you think about when you need to rely on quality, I can't think of a medicine more important than vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I have one other question regarding, or two actually. The next question is regarding transparency. And what we know is for seniors in particular, and this is for any witness, it's not just about how the drug or where the drug is manufactured, but it's whether or not they can trust that what's in their pill bottle is safe, effective, and available when they need it. Too often, our system reacts after a crisis instead of putting preventive measures in place, leaving seniors and their caregivers to find out too late that their medication is suddenly unavailable. So how should we be thinking about transparency, not just as a tool for regulators and industry, but as a preventive measure that empowers patients, especially seniors, to make informed choices about their medications and avoid being blindsided by shortages? And that's for any witness.
I'll be brief to allow others time as well. I would emphasize pharmacy, if I might. So there's a big gap to the patient in knowledge and understanding, but we have an army of hundreds of thousands of healthcare practitioners called pharmacists out across our country who are unusually close to patients, have access on essentially a prescription by prescription basis. That's a huge positive. There's an opportunity to have them play a more active role when it comes to supply chain and quality. It's not typically a topic that they touch. And so I think if we want to be able to help empower patients, we're going to have to solve this through partnership with pharmacy and pharmacy organizations that I know are very open and willing to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question on transparency. So this is something I've spent a lot of time working on, and when our paper that I talked about in my introduction got published, our author team started getting random emails from the public, scared emails about how can I find out where my drug is made? I don't know how to figure this out. So this is something that we were able to do in this study we published, but it is very difficult. And this is why we advocate for forcing firms to put the country, the location on the label so that it's transparent for everyone. We've developed a website that we're hoping to launch where you can type in a national drug code number and a flag will pop up to tell the consumer this is where it's made. Even developing that website by this author team that we worked on this paper has been very hard for us because it's a difficult step to go from a national drug code, which is on every drug label, to a country manufacturer, which is very hard to find out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Alsbrooks. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that Indian generic drug manufacturers using fake labs to pump out fake results to show a product was never tested. Can you talk us through what is supposed to be happening and what you found and how you found it?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, what is supposed to be happening is that the FDA publishes manufacturing standards and the Code of Federal Regulations that they're supposed to follow. It says when you test something, for example, you're supposed to report all the results that you generate. You can't just pick one or two that you like and then use that as the data to release the product. So that's what's supposed to happen. But what we found when we started the unannounced inspection pilot back in 2012 and 2013 is that those standards aren't being always followed. So, some players are following those standards, but some aren't. And it's difficult because the ones that want to follow the rules oftentimes won't be able to win a contract to ship those products to the U.S. because they can't compete with the folks that aren't actually testing it. Because as already mentioned, it does cost a few more cents to do it right, but not a lot. But that makes a difference when the margins are so small.
Mr. Baker, in the book A Bottle of Lies, it talks about how foreign companies plan guided tours, but you rejected that, instead wanted to go directly to the quality control labs. Can you talk about your experiences with foreign companies? Why did they start with the tour? Why did you decide to change things up and go directly to quality control instead? And how does that change the inspection process? Were you the only one doing that? Do other inspectors do similar things?
Yeah, I remember the moment that we decided to focus on the unannounced inspection pilot, and we were, I had been trained to do inspections here in the U.S., and we did those before I got deployed to New Delhi, and fraud happens here too, but it's much more limited, like one person or a small group. And I remember the moment being over there, and I was with a co-inspector, and I just remember like we looked at each other and we thought, actually, this is everybody's involved in this. It's not just a single person or a small group. It comes from the top down, and it was kind of like a aha moment. It's like, we got to do something about this. And so we went back and worked with the folks at the MC to develop ways where we could gain further insight into what's actually happening, and that involved showing up unannounced, which hadn't been done prior to that. And so we would arrive unannounced and we would skip the conference room presentation and go straight to the lab. And what we found, like, for example, I can think of one that really just sticks out. It was one of the larger aseptically filling sites in the entire world. I mean, some of these are the size of a small town. And instead of going to the conference room, we went straight to the microbiology laboratory where they do the sterility testing. I mean, this is a life or death test. We walked in and there was only one microbiologist on staff. That was unusual, right? So we walked into the chambers where they're supposed to be testing all these products, and they were all there, but they were all unlabeled. And so we're like, well, where's the sample number on all these samples that you're supposed to be testing? All the paperwork was completed, no growth, it's sterile. But in reality, none of the products were getting tested. And once we sort of caught on that this was happening, that program expanded and continues to today. And again, like I mentioned, when those inspections are performed, they result in an ability to find those problems that are causing these adverse events. About 40% of the time we find issues, whereas in an unannounced inspection, where we show up and the dog and pony show continues, that's about a 5 to 10% chance of finding those problems because it's so much more difficult. We don't do announced inspections in the U.S. Why would you do that? You show up unannounced. You want to see what is the real quality of the product. So, this has shown that maybe the playing field isn't so level.
You mentioned that the bad players list is no secret, and these bad companies continue to avoid any significant consequences. That's telling me that the FDA knows which are the problem companies, but they aren't being inspected frequently enough or are still being allowed to import drugs. Does the FDA have a list of bad companies? What consequences should these companies be facing?
Yeah, that list exists. Yeah, I could just look into the database and see if I was going to fill a prescription, which provider I'd like to choose, and I'll do that pharmacy hopping to find it. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, what consequences should they?
Oh, yeah. So the consequences should be, if you're caught breaking the law, as outlined in the regulations, you should be prevented from shipping product to
So they've got a list.
Yeah.
And there's no consequences.
Very, very little consequences. So when the FDA takes action, what they'll do is they'll just shift those products to another facility in their network. And so it's this cat and mouse game, right? And so then this facility gets shut down. So now they're shipping out of this one. So then FDA goes over here. But by that time, this one's already back in the market. Because they'll go back 2 years later. It'll sometimes be an announced inspection, and the game resets. It's just I go here, and so just enforcing the law and saying if you break the laws, you're not going to be allowed to participate could go a long way.
And then we put that in our bodies.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, ranking member.
Very depressing. For Dr. Ball. you've studied the impact of 5-star quality ratings and country of origin labeling on consumer choice. But as you know, not everybody has the skill set that Mr. Baker described of being able to know which vendor is actually safe. So patients don't have much choice in choosing which medicines their pharmacies or hospitals or nursing homes choose to stock. And they arguably don't have the level of sophistication they would need to be able to choose anyway. In hospitals and some nursing homes, patients may not have access to containers where the 5-star quality rating or country of origin labels would be placed. So how can five-star rating quality rating how can a 5-star quality rating system and country of origin label promote the use of high-quality drugs when patients often don't have much choice? And how can this proposal incentivize hospitals and other purchasers to purchase high-quality drugs when institutions often face pressures to keep costs low? And third, how would you recommend that the FDA conduct inspections and update their 5-star quality ratings?
Thank you, Senator, for the great questions. So our solution that we've tested in our paper is a first step. And the first step is, and I've had my parents and elderly family members ask me, how do I know where this drug is made and if it's safe? If you arm the person at the pharmacy desk or the patient to look at a bottle and say, now, why is this a 3-star drug? That question in of itself could make a big difference, because groups like the AARP could all of a sudden have a voice to say, why are we selling 3-star or 2-star drugs to our constituents? You're correct that it wouldn't fix everything overnight, that hospitals, when they buy it in group packaging, may not have the stars on them until the solution get properly fixed there, that group purchasing organizations may be less sensitive. But the notion is that if it becomes transparent for every level of the supply chain, the manufacturers are no longer able to hide, and they have to somehow figure out a way to compete on quality. It wouldn't fix the problem overnight, but it would also allow group purchasing organizations who change suppliers based on pennies, which is often the case what we hear in our research, to look at this and say, yes, we may save a penny, but this is going from a 3-star drug to a 2-star drug. That has consequences for the people that are in the insurance program that they serve, or the elderly person that picks it up at CVS and asks their pharmacist, why are you giving me a 2-star drug? That conversation is the starting point to put pressure on firms. It's not perfect, but it's the beginning, and it's much better than what we have now.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, off of Dr. Ball's answers, how should country of origin labeling be implemented to take into account the origins of a generic drug's components versus the manufacturing site of the generic in its final form?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that because over the years, having seen the sites and thinking about transparency, that this would eventually come based on what we were uncovering. And there's no real perfect solution, but there are some, for each different type of drug, if you're talking about a solid oral product or an injectable product, there are at least one step that is very critical to quality for the purity and in some cases sterility. And so putting that on the label would force companies to take that step seriously and also possibly diversify supply chain for those critical steps to have those in areas that are reliable. And so, for example, an aseptically filled product, where is that bottle being filled?
Yep.
Because that is, again, there are other players, but that one is the most critical.
Dr. Piervincenzi, your written testimony indicated the United States relies heavily on India and China, and I think the chairman's questions about those two countries have been very insightful. And the majority of these KSMs are produced in China. You also highlighted how one KSM, thymidine, is produced only in China. Can you speak to why the United States is currently unable to produce certain key starting materials beyond the environmental impacts of the manufacturing process?
Yeah, so thank you, Senator. So the key starting material is this fancy term. I think, Senator Scott, you sort of said this earlier, that is only relevant to its use in a pharmaceutical ingredient. What the rest of the world will call them is chemicals. They're chemicals. The chemical industry had left the U.S. for the most part a long time ago, before pharma. In fact, that's how pharma started in the U.S. It followed the chemical industry in New Jersey, it became pharma. And so there's no mystery as to why it left the U.S. for environmental reasons and just cost and all the reasons we know. There is something unique about medicines is that they are very light users of very expensive chemicals. So what I mean is, and many of the chemicals used in drugs are used for lots of other industrial and other purposes, but in much, much larger quantities.
Yep.
So that the chemical company, so there are very rarely to have a key starting material company, because most of them are chemical companies who sell some key starting materials. They therefore are a small portion of their business. This further complicates this supply chain because later on, we're talking about medicines all the way along, API, finished dose, regulated by FDA, but these chemical companies they're not even in the medical business. So the incentive were to think about how do we secure our key starting materials. It's not only the area of greatest risk, it's what we least have in the US or even among US's allies. It's also the hardest of the three pieces to solve. And we think we have to look at the KSM model, your chemicals, and think, well, how do we start to source it? Where else in the world? You think we need to be more flexible about the world and think about it? And we may consider more onshoring on API, but we have to be pretty flexible on the key starting materials. But the current model is unsustainable. But we'll have some real numbers in a couple of months. I think it's about even less than 2 months where we can start to look at them as tangible. And Senator Scott, to your point earlier, we have to be able to have some data. Otherwise, it's very hard to get action going. And hopefully this will be the first time we have data on specifically what key starting materials, where, and then we have the very important next conversation is how else can we make them?
Yep.
And maybe just to wrap up there, but there are some cases we can make them a different way that doesn't follow the chemical industry, but uses biotech processes. And that we could do in the U.S.
That's good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing.
So, Mr. Baker, you highlighted the story of your grandmother. What was your experience pharmacy shopping? How many pharmacies did you visit? Did you find that they had the same drug from the same company? Was there diversity in manufacturers?
Yeah, I come from a pretty small town in Oregon called Lebanon, and there's about 3 pharmacies in the area, and so we went to all 3, and each one actually had the same product by the same manufacturer. So we reluctantly made that choice, and I felt bad because already then at the first pharmacy I already sort of hinted that this was not going to go well, and so it's an experience that's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. Because it shouldn't be like that. I think we can do better.
How'd you feel buying a drug from a company that just settled with the DOJ for faking lab data?
Yeah, it was a tough decision. And again, as I mentioned, trying to stay positive is the one thing, because you don't want to cause unnecessary panic in someone. And a lot of people ask me before they'll take it, they'll give me a call or send me an email like, hey, what do you think about this one? And I'll give them advice. And to be honest, over the years, sometimes I have to fake that advice because I know there's no alternative, and I'll have to just send a positive email when, in fact, inside I know that that's not the truth.
How do you do it when you buy drugs for yourself?
For myself, I would do the same thing. I live now in Austin, so I have more choices there, and try to do my best to shop around, or even consider like an online pharmacy if I can call them and find out where what manufacturer they're going to use to fill that prescription.
So do you believe Americans are dying because of poor oversight down at foreign generic drug manufacturing facilities?
Not poor oversight, but
No oversight?
but poor enforcement. No. But again, it's complicated to enforce because of the drug shortage issue. So it's no one person or one organization's fault. It's the system.
So why did the FDA set up this foreign surveillance system the way they did?
It was a collaboration with Embassy and FDA and folks at HHS to sort of evaluate, to tell the story, what we were finding in our initial times when those you mentioned heparin earlier, that was the reason, one of the reasons, but I think the main one why the foreign offices were established in strategic locations around the world was to be that sort of rapid response and gain further insight into what's happening with our supply chain. And I think, 15 years later, the picture is pretty clear.
So, Dr. Ball, so what causes if they're all FDA approved, what are some of the things that causes one to be different than the other one?
So I think the notion that if it has the same active pharmaceutical ingredient, dosage form, and route of administration, which is kind of what a generic equates to an original, if you match those, the drug will work. That discounts all of the manufacturing influence on quality. And so these are subtle changes, and my intuition is that they're often not on purpose. If I was in a market where I was only competing on cost, I would find the very cheapest place to make my product, the cheapest labor, the cheapest equipment, the cheapest suppliers. It's the rational thing to do. So when Peter says it's the system, it truly is, because I believe these manufacturers are acting very rationally. If you cannot judge quality and it is opaque, cost is the only thing that matters, that will inevitably reduce quality. It actually must. It's like a scientific fact. If you cut the corner in every part of making a product, if quality doesn't suffer, something's wrong. You haven't cut corners enough. So quality will suffer eventually. It's in every part of the supply chain.
Right. Mr. Baker, when you did a foreign site inspection, did the FDA or the foreign facility pay for your translator? And is that a problem either way?
Yeah, so in my experience, most of the translation is provided by the sales department within that company, who oftentimes has the best English because of their job. They don't know much about manufacturing, but they know they're supposed to tell the story well. So that's oftentimes what I experienced. Luckily for me, I had studied Mandarin for about 15 years prior to going to China, so I could sort of overcome those challenges. But yeah, that's the norm. Not always. Sometimes they'll provide an independent translator, but it's voluntary.
Yeah. Mr. Baker, when you went to China, did they let you just go anywhere you want?
Yes.
You could go, but the government would let you go anywhere, and you could walk into any facility, and you could walk around any facility you wanted?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had a very good working relationship with, they were called CFDA at that time.
Okay.
And they would shadow us on a lot of our inspections to learn our techniques.
Why would they shadow you?
To learn how we uncovered the issues that we were finding, using forensic computer inspection techniques, things like that.
So give me an example of a facility that you were most disappointed?
Most disappointed, I think, are the ones where there's multiple, but you would show up at the show. I mentioned this in the 5-minute testimony where you would show up at the show facility. This is the clean one, but we knew, like, showing up, you knew that there's no way they're making the amount of products that I can see on the customs import list, right? So there's no way. And so what you'll do is you'll try to find. You'll show up at midnight and just watch operations, from the outside, try to find out what's going on, and then you'll eventually uncover like a shadow facility. It can be like next door, or it can be somewhere else. You'll watch trucks come in, right? And when you find that shadow facility, that's, I think, one of the most concerning things, because those are totally off the radar. There's, I mentioned the problems with unannounced inspections, but just exponentially worse when you don't do any inspections there. And so and I think when we were there, we probably figured that 10% of the API getting exported to the U.S. was from shadow facilities. That was just, I have no data to support that. That was just a rough number that we sort of came up with. And compounding pharmacies are really suffering as a result of this, because they're importing products and they really don't have any ability to determine where they're coming from.
How long could the facility that was doing the wrong thing stay in business before they're shut down?
A long time, especially if they had any drug that was on the shortage list. And so you could prevent some of their products from reaching the U.S., but they'd continue to ship a couple that we called them carve-outs, right? Because we just couldn't prevent the supply. And then they'll ask for reinspection in about 1 to 2 years. FDA will go back, and oftentimes that will be unannounced because it's resource intensive to do unannounced all the time. And then that would be a choreographed inspection, and the clock resets. So they can hang on for years because we are addicted to these sites.
Okay. Dr. Ball, You reviewed adverse event data that the FDA had and cross-referenced that to drugs made in India, right?
Correct.
Okay, where does the adverse event data come from? And what did you consider to be an adverse event? And what conditions were eliminated as an adverse event?
So an adverse event that we used FDA's FAERS database, and they make the determination. So the manufacturer must report an event that occurs that they hear about where a consumer was injured, hospitalized, or died because of a drug. And then through the FDA's analysis of these adverse events, there are flags that are put on to the adverse event. Things like a drug characterization field. That field means that the drug is the likely cause of the event. And a D-challenge field. The D-challenge field means that if the patient was taken off the drug, the problem that's discovered went away. So we tested just the D-challenged drugs, which was very convincing for us as an author team. We're really onto something here because our effects still hold on the D-challenged drugs, on those that cause death, hospitalization, or injury. So to answer your very first question, the firm must report it when they hear about it. It's mandatory.
When the firm, who's that?
The manufacturer.
Okay.
So the manufacturer hears about adverse events from patients, from physicians, from lawyers.
But there's no obligation that a patient say it.
Correct.
There's no obligation that a hospital, and there's no obligation that a doctor.
Correct. And the order you just gave, though, the nurses and physicians are much more attuned to how the system works than patients. And so from our experience, like physicians and hospitals know that this FAERS database is there and that they need to report what they have found. But there is no obligation. There's a selection bias there. So it must be underreported. It has to be because it's not forced. But this does come back to the FDA's enforcement authority because these reports come into firms and these firms maintain complaint databases. And when you can access those complaint databases on an unannounced inspection, you're going to get a real honest look into how the quality of the firm is operating versus if you give them even a week's notice, the look may not be the same.
What's the total list of adverse reactions? Do you have a list of how many?
I can get that to you. It's incredibly long.
Would it be 500,000?
I know it's in the thousands. It's a very long list.
Okay. Why do you think it's different in the United States if it's manufactured in the United States versus India or China?
So this is speculation somewhat because in the study we were not able to get at that core mechanism. But theoretically, it makes a lot of logical sense that when you source a product in the lowest cost place, where you are furthest from the regulator, the temptation to cut corners that will affect quality just goes up and up. And then to accentuate that temptation, if quality is assumed to be high, as soon as you get FDA approval, you have that stamp of approval, you no longer have to worry about quality. And so the difference, I think, lies in the fact that in the United States, you are much closer to the FDA. Their authority is much more felt. And the costs of the suppliers and the raw materials, they're more. And as soon as you get that far away, the FDA's authority is more distant, and the cost of everything is lower, and that lower cost will come through in lower quality.
And you don't have oversight.
The oversight is much more distant. It's much more distant, and I don't envy the FDA. It's much harder to enforce their standards there.
So if I understand correctly, according to your study, generic drugs manufactured in India have a 54% higher chance of an adverse event, which hospitalization, disability, and death, compared to a similar drug made in the U.S., right?
That's correct.
So let's say you're going to buy two of anything. Let's say you're going to buy two cars. If you knew if you bought one of them, if you bought one car, you had a 54% chance of something bad happening to you. So what would you do?
Well, because cars have quality ratings like J.D. Powers, I would buy the higher quality rated car, but that can't be done in drugs. But if I knew the difference, then I would spend the money to buy the higher quality product.
Yeah. You think the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration would let a car that was 54% more dangerous on the road?
See, and the regulator, NHTSA, doesn't have to worry too much about that because car quality is accessible to the consumer before they buy it. And that's the difference between that and the pharmaceutical industry. It's unaccessible before you buy it and oftentimes even after you buy it. This adverse event increase is hidden in millions of adverse events. That's what makes studies like this so difficult. There's so many data points that it's easy for these types of increases to hide.
What was the FDA's reaction to your study?
So while I've worked with the FDA before, since we published that paper, I've not had a lot of interaction with the FDA. And in the last several months, some of my contacts have left. And so I don't honestly know what the FDA's reaction is.
Okay. Did your study show a difference in quality between generic drugs made in developed nations like Canada or the EU compared to India?
There is an overall difference between emerging economies and advanced economies. But when we took that difference and we broke it out by country, the only country difference was India to US. So no, there wasn't a difference between US and Canada. However, the volume of drugs in our study was overwhelmingly advanced economy drugs were US and overwhelmingly emerging economy drugs were India. So the volume helped make the difference findable, but it was something that we didn't see when we compared like US to Canada, for instance.
So what was the landscape of generic drugs that you looked at? Did you limit it to sterile injectables, or did you try to look at everything?
We looked at everything that we could get label data on.
So statins, antibodies, antibiotics, and blood pressure medications?
All of those. Everything that had a label on the database we used, we measured it.
Okay. Why do you think the FDA doesn't require, country of origin of ingredients and country of origin of manufacturing? Why don't they do it?
So this is speculation, of course, but I believe that there's a few reasons. I have heard that through some of our discussions with them that if they were to put quality or country labeling, it could cause some unexpected market reactions. It could cause shortages, for instance. Because if you look at a drug and there's...
People might buy American first?
And if the supply isn't there, then all of a sudden we have overnight shortages because we've made the market transparent. That's one of the concerns I've heard. The other is that I believe, and this is speculation, that the FDA doesn't think they have the authority to force the manufacturer to put the country on there. They believe that's company confidential information. And then the quality rating is something that we've taken from data that they possess, and we've come up with a measure that we believe they could translate it to, but it's not something that's immediately available right now.
Mr. Daniels, I think you said that China supplies about 90% of antibiotic APIs consumed in the U.S. Can you talk about how you figured this out?
Yes. So what we found was that 90% of the antibiotic APIs used by India, and India being the vast majority of the generic antibiotics that we were getting, were manufactured in China. And the way that we mapped this, we took every single critical medicine that we had in our study. We built a bill of materials for each of them. So every single component of that pharmaceutical, of that drug. And what we did was once we had that bill of materials, we identified each supplier that was connected to every single one of those components. Once we identified the supplier, we knew how much of the active ingredient was in every dose, and we could see the doses that were being consumed in the United States. We mapped that up to supplier capacity, supplier volumes coming into those companies, which we have proprietary data and customs, trade, shipping, invoicing data that informs us as to what's happening between those two companies. And we could see where the next company was sourcing their key starting materials, excipients, whatever it might have been, at that next level. So we just kept tracing down the line to the facility. So we knew which facility was actually producing which chemical compounds. Once we got down to that facility, We cross-referenced the data that we had pulled through with their certification levels, their employee information, their square footage to ensure that that capacity was visible and to identify things like shadow facilities, which there certainly is a significant volume of that kind of product coming through. And then we rolled that all the way back up to the supply chain and identified that essentially these manufacturers in India were using this significant cost differential between the locally made goods and what was being made in China, and we're utilizing that to accelerate and to expand margins in the goods being sent to the United States.
So are there other drugs that you're aware of that we have such acute dependency on communist China or another adversarial country?
Yeah, about 50% of our critical medicines are in that category.
So do you think this is a national security risk?
It 100% is.
So I'm a grandfather. Kids usually get ear infections and strep throat. So if China would drop our ability and limit antibiotic-related APIs from being exported, would it impact us?
Yes, you'd see at least 50% of the antibiotics that your kids have access to evaporate. In fact, the next time one of your grandchildren gets a strep throat or an ear infection, I encourage you to look at it. I bet you dollars to donuts it's made by Aurobindo, which is an Indian manufacturer using Chinese KSMs and APIs.
And so do you think this could create a public health emergency?
It almost did during COVID. I experienced it. I was working with Honorable Ellen Lord, and Jen Santos and Stacey Cummings, and when they said they were going to drown us in a sea of COVID, I mean, those calls really did happen.
And how long do you think, if they shut it off tomorrow, how long do you think our supply is for?
I mean, it's months. As Dr. Piervincenzi said, it's months.
So,
but it's months. It's months with severe constraints. I mean, you'd probably be treating, you'd be treating people in sepsis. Kids would have to weather through, and that could be very dangerous.
Are there any sole source drugs, which there was only one supplier,
There are.
and they're relying on communist China or India?
There are.
Would you have?
I don't have the names off the top of my head, but I remember looking in the study, there were significant volumes.
So, let me make sure I got this right. 95% of ibuprofen is imported from China.
95% of ibuprofen. So there is a key starting material that 95% of it, I believe, is pulled from China, is sourced from China, and that ingredient then goes into ibuprofen. There are other ways in which to source that same material. The same goes for acetaminophen. There are other ways to source that material, but they're not cost advantageous, and so therefore are not used.
So 91% of hydrocortisone is imported from China. Does that sound right?
That sounds right.
Ingredients?
Yeah.
Okay. So half of U.S. penicillin and heparin are imported from China? That sounds
Yes.
right? So, this doesn't make any sense. So the federal government knows this and has done absolutely nothing about it.
At the moment, after COVID, there was a huge fervor. It died. We started studying the problem and stopped executing against the reshoring and strategic activities. I'm hopeful that HHS, particularly the FDA, picks this up, but as of right now, we are not actively policing these supply chains.
Are you familiar with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act?
I am, Chairman, yes.
Do you think that's being complied with?
I do not believe we are conducting significant or thorough investigations in this pharmaceutical space. And at the beginning of the year, there was a significant drop in detentions that would indicate a lower volume of enforcement. Those have since rebounded, Chairman Scott. And I think we could significantly stiffen and significantly strengthen our policing of that law.
Have you tracked the Department of Defense reliance on China for drugs?
I have, yes.
So are
Yes, sir.
we, do we have our own source, so our military is never dependent on China?
We do not.
Why wouldn't we?
We, in many areas, are reliant on. It's kind of like we have in critical minerals and in magnets, Chairman Scott, where the commercial markets have so deeply been usurped by China that we don't have the investment capital coming in to offset it. And so just like we're doing in MP materials and, neodymium iron boron magnets and things like that for our weapon systems, we have to make those same kind of investments in our pharmaceutical supply chains.
So if China invades Taiwan or continues to attack the sovereignty of the Philippines, and we go to their defense, do you think they'll keep shipping us drugs?
I think, Chairman Scott, it would be a key tactic to stop doing us.
Or do you think it would be safe for our military to continue taking Chinese drugs?
No, sir.
Can you explain the role that Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army linked entities play in the generic drug supply chain, and how federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid are paying for it?
Yes, Chairman Scott. So the PLA is infused into the Chinese economy. It's called the military civil fusion. And in many cases, and as we've pointed out in the Bitter Pill report, several of the organizations that are producing these active pharmaceutical ingredients or KSMs are actually sponsored and funded by PLA-funded entities or directly by the PLA. And those situations create a significant amount of command and control, what we call foreign ownership control and influence risk in those companies, and make them essentially beholden to not only the CCP, but the PLA.
So would you say that the U.S. healthcare system is entirely beholden to the Communist Party of China?
At the moment, yes, sir.
Dr. Piervincenzi, how many sole source APIs come from Communist China?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. We are aware of 11 that are directly coming from China, but that's not the real answer. The real answer is the APIs who are coming from China to India, and we know that's where 95% of our challenge is. I think antibiotics are a unique case, and it's real, and it was strategic. It was a choice in China many years ago, in fact, 15 years ago, to have that as a strategic asset, and it was successful while the world wasn't really paying attention. But that's a bit of an outlier. I think the vast majority of reliance on China is coming back to the starting materials, the chemicals, in some cases the excipients as well, less often, but in some cases.
So how many generic drugs use key starting materials from China?
We are going to have a real answer for that, but it's going to be somewhere in the range of 20 to 40% would be my guess. But give me about 2 more months and we'll have a better answer for you.
So how about brand name drugs? Do they use APIs from India or China?
Rarely, and it just goes to the different incentives. It's not that they couldn't, it's just that it's not necessary. The incentive is high-value products. We need to have a very reliable supply chain. Their finished dose is rarely in those countries. They don't want to have a big, complicated supply chain halfway around the world, so they try to simplify. And so therefore, you see the APIs manufactured mostly in US, Europe, Canada. If you think of those, that's going to be your majority. A bit more in Europe than the US in this case.
So what sort of random testing of generics drugs happen in our marketplace?
So the U.S. market is a bit unique in the world today. There is a risk-based approach at FDA, which is taking into account known issues, and that drives testing, and FDA has its own labs and, of course, can outsource testing as well. But there's very little random testing, and currently, today, there really is no private sector solution to do so. This is relatively common practice in most markets, including in Europe, but in middle-income countries as well. It's generally called post-market surveillance, which is a fancy way to say you buy something from the pharmacy and you test it.
Does USP track how many drugs Americans are taking that rely on Chinese APIs?
Yes.
And does that present a risk to our supply chain?
Well, if you believe that China supplying our drugs is a risk, then the answer would be yes. Okay.
Okay. So, how many of you would buy a generic drug made in India or China if you knew there was American-made drug available? Anybody?
So, Senator, if I'm an offer,
Yep.
I would if I had the assurance on the front end of the system.
Right.
The system, as we described, is tilted today, and that's the issue. And that it's an important nuance to me because that's where the solution lies, is that untilting. And I think that's a consistency that you hear from us.
So I think if you listen today, based on the testimony, Americans, we have hospitalizations, we have illness and death because of adverse effects from some foreign-made generic drugs. Does anybody disagree with that? So bad drug quality doesn't just mean drugs are less effective, which it could be, right? But it also make you sicker, could kill you. So every American senior, see if you agree with this, every American senior needs to look into their medicine cabinet and ask this question. Am I confident that the generic drugs I'm taking are truly safe? Do you believe today they could say that? They have any ability to say that? Does any of you think they have any ability to say that today, that if they look in their medicine cabinet or they go to their pharmacy, they can say it's safe? So I talked about Leroy Hubley. Lost his wife at 48 years, Bonnie, and his son Randy, just weeks apart due to contaminated heparin that they needed for their dialysis treatment. It's horrible. This should never happen in this country. If Americans don't know where the generic drugs they're taking are made, if there's no measurement system, there's no way they can feel confident, they can feel safe. It's clear that we have a big problem. So I'm from Florida. I was the governor. We have hurricanes. At least in hurricanes, in contrast to some other things, at least you can get out of the way, or you should. I always told people that you can rebuild that house, but you can't rebuild your life. And you told people get prepared. It seems like we're, number one, even if we didn't have the concern about the way Communist China acts, we'd say to ourselves, it's crazy that we're not focused on quality and focused on supply. But on top of that, we know that we have Communist China that is threatening Taiwan and threatening the Philippines. And why in God's green earth would we ever allow our country to be dependent, whether you're talking about anybody that takes a generic drug, including our seniors, or why would we ever put our military in that position? It just doesn't make any sense. I think the bottom line is we have no choice, but we have to make significant change. I hope the new the head of the FDA will take this seriously, and hopefully we'll see change. I think the way we're going to see change is by if the American public demands it. My experience as governor of Florida, my experience in this job is that if people demand it, then it's going to happen. People continue to be complacent, it's not going to happen. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here today and participating. I look forward to continuing to work with members across the aisle. If any senators have additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added, the record hearing will be open until next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Anything else anybody wants to add? Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.